Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Alex Katehakis, and this is the Mirror of Intimacy webinar. Today is Monday, November 8th, and I welcome you to the topic of lust today. As always, if you would type your questions into the Q&A box, then I'll be able to see them and answer them for you. And also, any books that I state or information or resources will be typed into the chat box for you. And there you'll also find URLs for books for Mirror of Intimacy. I want to remind you to please take a moment to write a review for Mirror of Intimacy if you buy the book. And also you can follow us on Instagram or Facebook. So the quote of the day today is a little confounding. I had to read it several times and I thought maybe there was a typo in it or it wasn't quite right. And I finally deciphered the quote. So before I read it to you, I want to make some things clear to put it in context because it is paradoxical in some ways. So in the field of psychotherapy, when we talk about attachment, we're talking about the very primary processes that takes place in human development from the minute we're born. And from the minute we're born and that primary caregiver, that mothering figure, whether male, female, or trans, etc., but it has to be a mothering consistent figure we typically think of as female, is attuning to that infant in such a way that she is creating what we call secure attachment. The child is able to regulate itself, it's getting and giving cues back and forth, and all of that is bringing its brain and its nervous system to fruition so it can operate in a solid, secure way in life. In Hindu thinking and in Buddhist ideas also, attachment is problematic. Attachment means we're grasping to something. Attachment is thought of as the primary source of suffering sometimes when we just can't let something go. So, in this quote from Osho, if you were reading it from a psychological perspective, you'd say, wait a minute, that first line is wrong. It's actually the opposite of what he's saying. But if you hear it from a non-attachment perspective, from a Buddhist or Hindu perspective, you'll hear it differently. So the quote is, if love has attachment in it, it is lust. So meaning, if you're grasping at your lover, it's lustful. If love has no attachment in it, only then is it not lust. So if you are with your lover and you love them and love is a freeing power, there's no lust to it. It's not greedy. And lust is being used as a greedy term here. When you are in lust, you are not really thinking of the other, thinking of your beloved or lover. You are simply using the other for your own ends. So lust in this way of thinking is greedy, it's cloying, it has suffering involved in it. And I would go so far to say is that this is also how we think of love addiction. It's a form of grasping at the other. I would use grasping more than I would use attachment, but I would also say it's an attachment to an outcome, an unrealistic outcome. And further in that statement from Osho, and this quote comes from his book, The Beloved, Volume 2, which I believe Melissa can type into the chat box there so you can find the book if you're interested in his many teachings, which were beautiful about love and sex. He's saying that with attachment to a lover, you're bound because you want to possess that person. You want them over and over again, and you need that person in order to function, which is problematic. And that love is a gift, so you shouldn't be worried about whether your lover will be there tomorrow or not, because lovers give freely even if nobody's there. That we're constantly, giving our love to all sorts of things, which is a different way of thinking about a lust for life, for example. And he even stated that the Buddha, while sitting under the Bodhi tree, was filled with love. And he was overflowing with love, but no one was there as a recipient of it. So in many, many forms, love and lust can come in these many forms. So think about, in Osho's way of thinking, that lust is greedy, it's attachment, it's possessive. And that in his way of thinking, love needs no possession, There is no attachment, that love is a gift and it's just something we're giving away. So when we often think of lust as a strong sexual desire, that's how we in the West interpret that word. But lust can be a strong desire for anything. And the problem is if you get attached to that thing. So you can have a lust for a delicious piece of cake this afternoon, or be lusting for Thanksgiving when you're going to be able to get together with friends and family, maybe for the first time in a couple of years. There's a lust for life that is a vitality state, which is the state I think we should be most interested in, not this greedy, collapsing lust that has us yoked to something in a way that can feel destructive and even addictive. So, lust can also be an intense longing, such as a lust to succeed or a lust to acquire something. If you've always had a dream job or a dream career, there is lust that's driving that. And it's important to consider that lust is one of the seven circuits, eight circuits that all mammals have in their brains. Lust originates in the brainstem, so you can't eradicate lust. We are lustful creatures. We're seeking that exuberance and excitement in life. And so I don't think it's prudent to think about eradicating lust. I do think it's prudent to thinking about the attachment to the thing that we acquire. And lust can also mean enthusiasm or an eagerness, as I said before, a lust for life. Um, and so that definition uh, is unique to how we're using it, and we have to be careful about how we're thinking about this word. And the definition that I'm most interested in, that the Merriam-Webster dictionary pathologizes, well, they don't pathologize it, they actually call it obsolete, is that is pleasure or delight. When I think of lust, I think of pleasure or delight. I don't think of greed. I don't think of perversion. I don't think of attachment to something. And I think if we keep that definition in mind for this conversation, then we'll have a different experience of lust. So some of the tantric paths talk about lust as a way of living, that every day we're living in pleasure. And so some paths, some spiritual paths are paths of renunciation, where you have to give all your material goods up. The most extreme example are monks who have nothing, not a penny to their name, and they walk through the countryside with their begging bowl, waiting for people to give them food, to give them rice, so they have something to eat on this path of renunciation in search of awakening or enlightenment. But in other paths, pleasure is the path. All of the bodily senses, taste, touch, smell, um, sexuality, desire, all go together with lust. And not in again, a pornographic way where it's disembodied, but in a way of knowing oneself more deeply and sharing all of the bounty of the universe, which is an appropriate way of thinking about this month, since this is a month of gratitude and bounty and pleasure when we sit down at a Thanksgiving meal, sharing with the people around us. And so this is a good time to ask ourselves, what do we want to share on Thanksgiving Day? Is it just a gluttonous feast? Is it just that sort of ravaged kind of lust of just stuffing yourself silly? Or is it a lust for a bounty, a gratitude, a great appreciation for the fact that you even have food on your table and that you have people around you that care about you? So, most of us have experienced moments in our lives where we are becoming more mature and becoming more masterful and really understanding who we are and what we want. When lust clouded our decision making or it coerced us into, um, doing something we wish we hadn't had done. So that's a time when lust has yeah, it's really coerced us into overriding our good judgment. So again, if we look at this neurobiologically, this lust circuit comes from the brainstem, and it is an impersonal, implicit, bodily based, more primitive circuit that's going to drive us to taking whatever we want, whatever it is. And our prefrontal cortex, the part of our brain that allows for our intelligence, our abstract thinking, our ability to see the consequences of something, if it's strong enough, if we are securely attached, will be able to have us holding and waiting and saying, I really want to think about that first. I need to think about whether this impulse is really good for me or not, as opposed to just being driven by our impulses. But nonetheless, we've all been driven by those impulses at different times in our lives, certainly when we were less mature than we might be today. And that's part of growing up and having life experiences, especially when they were fun and a little out there, but they didn't really hurt us in any significant way. And lust can pull us towards overriding feelings of loneliness or pain. If we're in deep, deep despair or sad about feeling like we're unlovable or not loved, we can become obsessed with sources of pleasure outside of ourselves, whether it is drugs, alcohol, pornography, sex with people that don't really care about us, food, shopping, gambling, you name it. We can always be seduced by lust when it comes to mitigating painful feelings or experiences, or even feelings of feeling just kind of dead inside, where we're needing some kind of excitation, so we're seeking excitation. And likewise, we can become obsessed with unavailable people, which I think that's been going on since the beginning of time. Billie Holiday famously said, unrequited love's a bore, but I've got it pretty bad. And it is a bore because it's a one-way street. It's the object of our affection is not being returned to us. And you could call that attachment also, that we are attaching to something that's creating suffering. It's not the kind of love that the Buddha was giving, which is a free flowing outpouring of love with no expectation in return, just a radiance of that sort of lust for life, if you will. And we can become obsessed with that unavailable person through fantasy, and we make their interest more real in us than it actually is. And that takes up a lot of space in the brain. There's a lot of real estate that gets occupied, wherein you could be using that time and energy for something else, whether it's learning a language or learning a new dance step or reading a book or any number of other things that give you pleasure, even though it's not genital pleasure or bodily based pleasure. I guess it could be bodily based pleasure if you're going for a run or surfing or swimming in the ocean or skiing or doing something that makes you feel really good. Those are the sorts of lustful activities I want you to think about. The question of what brings you pleasure, what lights you up, what delights you, what has you really practicing self love in those ways. So, all of these things I'm talking about mask pain, and then they create a new kind of pain. So, it becomes a vicious cycle of I'm lonely, I'm sad, I feel depressed. And so I'm going to go use something outside of myself to make myself feel better, something I'm lusting after, something I feel greedy or gluttonous about. And I'm going to do it until I feel sick or I feel bad afterwards. And then I'm right back where I started because it's not the solution to the problem that you're having. It's a problematic solution, and it's a short lived, very, very short lived solution that only digs a deeper hole. So, this is the reason that the notion of lust is so confusing because it's paradoxical, like many, many things in life. We could say there's, good lust and bad lust, just like we talk about healthy shame and toxic shame. So maybe it's healthy lust and toxic lust that we're talking about. Someone's asking here, can you please talk more about objectification with one's lover in a monogamous relationship? I'm married to a sex addict and used to enjoy a sense of objectification during sex before I found out about how he objectified others. Now that I've found out about his betrayal, I'm confused about this. Well, this is not really so much about lust as it is about objectification. And that's something that you have to square with yourself, because you have to decide whether you want to be in relationship with this person and whether they actually want to be in relationship with you. And once that's true, you have to have explicit conversations about objectification and what you like about it and what you want and what he or she likes and he or she wants. And until people get really unvarnished and vulnerable with each other, these all of these things become very, very confusing. Um, for recovering sex addicts who have difficulty with healthy attachment and where lust has historically played a role in active addiction via fantasy, can lust play a healthy role in recovery? Yes, and that has to do with the difference of what I'm talking about, this idea of healthy lust versus toxic lust. When lust is about a full body experience and a full pleasure experience, and it's about the other person as a human being, not just as an object to be consumed or used, then it is 100% a healthy proposition because it's just part of how we're made up. It's just how we are as mammals. Someone says, I have a pattern of limerent attachment that I don't feel I have a choice over. And do you have recommendations for dealing with mental hijack over lust? I would say the answer to that is really recovery. That you have to have a strong recovery program before you can answer a question like that. I think probably everybody has had some religious or spiritual experience where they've been told or experienced that lust is a great sin, that lust is something we should be shamed of. And that is one of the things that creates toxic shame, is that message, is that we shouldn't feel that way. And we've all experienced, the dogma of the perils of lust, the fear mongering threats that go with that, that can really repress our spirituality and our sexuality in pretty egregious ways. And it can take a lifetime to dig out from underneath those messages because shame is so deeply embedded in the body. And it's a red hot feeling when we feel it. And so, because of that, it makes it very difficult for people to explicitly express their sexual desires to a lover. We talk a lot about authenticity and vulnerability when it comes to recovery or just being honest in life, but we don't talk that much about really moving that into the sexual realm. Like, how honest and authentic and real are you really about your sexual preferences and your lust for sexuality? How much of that is underground, furtive, secretive, and shaming, which puts it in the addiction realm? Um, and so there's much that's unfair about this topic of lust, right? There's a lot of confusion about it because it's often tied to desire, and desire always leaves us wanting more. So we have to be able to experience our lust within reason, to have control over lust by way of our prefrontal cortex. And if you're somebody who's impulsive and therefore addictive, you're going to have a hard time with this. Because that lust pathway has created a fantasy pathway, which in many cases can be dissociative and have you acting in ways you wish you weren't acting, or narrowing your focus down into objectifying people or preying on people for your own ends, your own uses, the use of attachment to an outcome, if you will. And so, really, recovery is crucial, and stopping all of that first before you can start to reincorporate it into your life in a way that is healthy and pleasure producing and pleasure giving, that isn't selfish or greedy or dissociative, actually. So we get tempted by lust because of this circuitry in our brain. It motivates us towards pleasure. And what would our life be like if we weren't motivated towards pleasure? If when a friend said, do you want to go for a hike or to a movie, you didn't say, yes, I want to do that. That's a pleasure state, right? What would your life be like? It would just be completely dull if we didn't have any lust for life, or someone saying, oh, I heard about this great Mexican restaurant. Do you want to go try it? And you say, yes, of course. I lust after Mexican food. It's one of the great delights of living in Southern California. So let's see if there are any other questions here. Um, Someone writes, since I discovered my husband's infidelity, I struggle with lust towards other men. It was never a problem for me until after discovery. Now it's persistence, almost like vengeance. Can you provide any insight into that? Well, that tells me that you're just really angry and you haven't repaired your relationship with your husband, and you haven't forgiven yourself, you haven't forgiven him, that you're not through with that process yet. And so, lusting after other men, again, you're objectifying other men, you're attached to some kind of outcome there, is a form of retaliation. And you're really hurting yourself with that because you have unfinished business. And that could lead you to having an affair. And then, how are you going to feel about that? And does that create more mess in your life? Or do you just need to end your relationship with your current partner because that's what's really true for yourself, but you're not telling yourself the truth? I don't know if that is true for you. It may not be, but that the way you're talking about lust and revenge and vengeance all sounds like an escape from the actual pain that you're experiencing and the context of your life that you don't want to face. So I would suggest you turn and face the consequences of your life and make a hard decision about what you want to do. If you want to stay, you have to repair, and if you want to leave, you should leave. But the in between place is what gets us all into trouble on multiple fronts. So think about pleasurable moments in your life. What pleasurable moments do you have every day? If you're lucky, waking up in a warm bed is a pleasurable moment. Having food to eat anytime you open your refrigerator is a pleasurable moment. A hot cup of tea or coffee on a chilly fall day, pleasurable. Nice clothing, having something warm against your body. A hot shower, incredibly pleasurable. Feeling sunshine on your face if you live here in Southern California or warmer climates. A cool summer breeze, touch from a pet. I picked up my cat this morning and I realized I hadn't picked her up all weekend, and that was so pleasurable. She's so cuddly and furry. Um, Time with a loved one is pleasurable, time with a lover. There are a million different ways we experience pleasure on any given day. And collapsing this notion of lust and pleasure into genital contact is a really, it's a poverty mentality, it's a deprivation mentality. So see if you can expand your definition of pleasure today as you go through your day thinking about this topic. And what would happen if, when we lust for something and we don't get it? Can you lust without being attached to that particular outcome, as Osho points the way to? Lust and desire aren't the problem. It's the expectation that we hold that's the problem. It's the disappointment we experience when we don't get what we want. I might have a hankering for a cappuccino during the week because I'm not a daily coffee drinker. But when I want it in a particular way. And it's not always convenient. It can be, at a coffee shop a couple miles from where my office is. And if I have to settle for another kind of coffee that's kind of bitter or I don't like, it's disappointing because I don't like that coffee anyway. So I might have that lust arise. And then what am I going to do with it? Am I going to jet out of my office for 30, 40 minutes pushing it to go get that coffee and come back? I might if I have the time. But if I don't, am I going to settle for something that's second best and then feel kind of like, that was a waste of time and money? Or do I just say, you know what, I'm going to tolerate this lust for this thing, and I'm just going to drop it because I don't have time to get what I actually really want, and not create some drama or fire drill for myself about racing down the street to get the second best coffee. So see if you can play with lust like that as it arises for you on a daily basis, and practice this capacity to hold and wait for what I really want, as opposed to settling for something that's second best or something that might create drama in my life. How can one begging to forgive themselves or begin to forgive oneself when they're acting out so egregious against their significant other and family system? Well, that is a unbelievable spiritual demand that many, many addicts have to face and deal with. And it's a long road, and it's a daily practice of self forgiveness, and something I think that doesn't happen in a vacuum. I think you need a community of concern. You need a group, whether it's a men's group or a women's group. You need a 12-step fellowship. You need a therapist. Coming to self forgiveness is an integrated state neurobiologically. It's not just an idea like, oh, I forgive myself. I can say that, but the feeling in my chest is so tight, or the sickening feeling in my gut is so great. That can't be repaired just with a left brain thought. It takes being in the presence of other people who let you talk about how bad you feel about that, how angry you are at yourself, how stupid you feel, how abused you were that you would do something so egregious. Where a place where you can cry and feel those feelings, where people around you can support you. And you can't always get that from the family that you abused. You can't. So it takes an enormous amount of willingness on your part, an enormous amount of vulnerability, and a willingness to really get naked emotionally so that you can heal those issues. But it's a hero's journey. It's not for the weak of heart. And if you're defended against it or you're in a victim stance, it won't happen. Someone asks, does everyone need to have sexual desire? I never had high libido like my friends did during high school, and I don't have any childhood trauma per se. I've done therapy to check on that. Am I broken, or there are other people like me? Am I normal? Well, yes. I mean, there are many people that identify as asexual or demisexual who don't have a lot of sexual desire. But I would ask you if you have desire for other things in life. Do you get a tingling when you think about going on a trip? Or buying new music, or buying that coffee I was talking about? What are the things that light you up? And when I think about desire and sexual desire, it can come in so many forms. Touch, a desire for a massage can feel really yummy and good, especially when many people haven't had, that kind of massage or touch in the last couple of years. So ask yourself what feels pleasurable to you, what excites you, and follow that, and be disinterested in what the popular culture talks about when it talks about desire or sexuality or how you're supposed to be, and let yourself be you and see where that takes you. But that's a great question. Thank you for asking that. I've experienced lust only once in my life with one person who I also loved. We're both married, but when we see or hear one another's voice, we mutually have those desires. It's been over 30 years of trying to shake this. Why? What can happen to shake this? Well, maybe nothing. Maybe you just have some kind of interesting chemistry with that person. I don't know if it's based in a fantasy of something that will never happen, and that's what keeps it ignited. There's something about the mystery, the unavailability of that person, that creates excitation because it's novel. And so I think all you can do is have a mindfulness practice around it, and just notice that that's how you feel when you experience this human being. I think all of us probably could say that there was one person that we had the most electrifying sex with in our lives. And who's to say why that was? And oftentimes, those are the relationships that didn't work out. So be disinterested in the whys of it and just be willing to say, so it is. And I'm not going to make a story about it. I'm not going to act on it. I'm not going to destroy my marriage, that person's marriage. I'm just going to let it be. Someone asked, how does lust compare, contrast, or relate with jealousy and or envy? I think they're different. Lust is definitely its own discrete circuit in the brain. I would say jealousy and envy are attributed probably to the anger circuit in the brain. And so they really are two different things. Wanting somebody out of jealousy has a feeling of power and control to it, whereas lust doesn't. Lust is a vitality state. It's connected certainly to sex and sexuality, and to desire and to wanting, but it doesn't have that anger, underlying anger to it that jealousy does. Someone writes, I'm trying to date mindfully, and when I connect with someone after a few dates, there's sometimes a point of wanting sexual intimacy with them. There is a lust there, but it isn't so strong that it's overwhelming. After a sexual interaction with that person, I feel I've received sexual nourishment, but the relationship is most likely going to exist in this more casual realm for me. If I'm communicating clearly with that person, can this be considered a healthy version of lust within intimacy? Sure, but I would recommend that you slow it down because there's a gap between what you're saying. You're saying that there's a point of wanting sexual intimacy, there's lust, but it isn't strong. So there's a gap there. So rather than moving to genital contact, what would happen if you slowed down? What would happen if you experienced that person through touch, through sensuality, through other means of contact that wasn't actual intercourse? And how are you talking to that person about this being a casual encounter? Because some of the components that make for great sex, the first one 100% has to do with communication, and not just that we are communicating well, but that we're talking about what we like sexually in detail with each other. And the other is mutuality, which has to do with consent. And people think that they're consenting, but they're often vague about what they're consenting to. And there are a lot of assumptions that are made in that consenting conversation. The other thing is that consent is fluid. You can revoke consent in the middle of a sexual act. If somebody's massaging you and you decide you don't like that touch, you can say, I want to stop here. So there are a whole bunch of fine and thin slices between I feel lust, sexual lust for that person and having sex with them, that I would encourage you to employ so you can slow things down to ask yourself if this is something you really want, and is it in your best interest, and is it in your partner's best interest? Meaning, do they say it's in their best interest? It's not for you to judge that. Um, let's see. So Heidi is saying thank you for doing these webinars. And thank you, Heidi, for showing up and listening. I appreciate it. And let's see, somewhat similar to the previous question, within my mostly healthy and mostly monogamous relationship, I struggle with feeling bored in the absence of drama. There are times, usually triggered by him drinking alcohol, when he becomes negatively obsessed with his soon to be ex wife. While he focuses on how much he despises her, it still hurts my feelings. The urge to cheat on him becomes overwhelming. Whether I act on that or not, the result is always much more passionate physical intimacy. Do you have suggestions about a way to keep the lust alive? Okay, this is really complicated, Laura. So here we go. Um, you feel bored in the absence of drama. Well, that has to do with the absence of novelty and real connection with your partner. And I would venture to say that you have an unavailable partner. First of all, he's drinking. And secondly, when he drinks, he's obsessed with this divorce he's going through. And this is my bias. It's not a judgment. Well, it is a judgment. There's no morality attached to this, but I just think it's a bad deal to get involved with people that aren't divorced. And they might say, well, I've been separated for 6 months or 6 years even, but they're still energetically dragging that person around with them. They're not really available, as evidenced by this, that you can't help but think about this unfinished business that's in the background. And not only is it unfinished, there are legal documents going back and forth, there are communications, there's anger, resentments. I mean, it's just a mess. And I think that when we are responsible, we wouldn't date anybody if we were going through a divorce either, because that person's still married. Like it or not, energetically, they're married. And so when he gets drunk and he starts ranting about the ex wife, you get angry. And that anger starts to mobilize you. And you want to go have sex with somebody else because you're activated. That's high sympathetic arousal. It's excitatory. You've got energy that you want to discharge. You want to discharge some anger, and it sounds like what's happening between the two of you is that you end up having this probably aggressive kind of sex, which is fine and can be fun. But the way that you're getting there is distorted. If you were getting there because the two of you sat down and said, you know what, I like sex that's kind of hot, that's kind of aggressive, that's kind of a little kinky, and this is the way I like it, and you are actually explicating it and role playing it, you would have a different kind of experience. You wouldn't have to stir up this anger that has you wanting to go have sex with someone else. So, again, this is about being honest and not deceiving ourselves and therefore deceiving each other. Okay, so I'm going to forge ahead with the topic of lust, and maybe I'll come back to some of these questions. Um, all right, so it would be a cruel joke if we had to denounce lust all the time, and I think that's what happened during the puritanical period that so famously still runs through our culture. Is that it was decided at some point, because we have these big brains, we should be able to control our animal nature, and therefore we should be demure. We shouldn't have animalistic kind of sex. Everything should be very puritanical and buttoned down. But we could see where that got us, and it's also a cruel joke. Because in the Mirror of Intimacy, we cite the story of Icarus, and Icarus was a young boy, and he was given these beautiful waxen wings and told not to fly too close to the sun. And of course, he does, to his peril. But it's like telling people they shouldn't masturbate when we're designed, our hands are designed to touch our genitalia. So if we weren't supposed to masturbate, we would have had shorter arms, is all I can think about for that. So it's not about, denouncing it. It's about being discerning. And why put people in situations they can't handle and then condemn them to suffering, which is what we do, often as parents, what was done to us as childhood, what was done to us with religion, and all sorts of moral ideas about sex and sexuality. And lust can really inflame us sexually. And we can find sex as a refuge, as this person wrote, that when her, partner is obsessing about his ex-wife and she's angry and she wants to go have sex with someone else, they find refuge in sex with each other because they want to connect with each other. And that is a way to have sex also. But it's a place where nobody can get to either one of them. It's a place where it feels like we have personal power also, but I would say that's a false kind of power. Temporarily it could be fun and on occasion, but if it's the only way these two people can connect, it's going to be problematic over time. And surrendering to lust can sometimes unconsciously be based on our desire to reclaim a sense of personal power. So if you're feeling disempowered in your life, I don't recommend that you depend on sexual lust to make yourself feel powerful. And we have to be mindful about checking our desires, and to make sure that they align with our value system, especially since desire always leaves us wanting more. It's just the nature of desire. We're unsatisfied creatures. Um, and so make sure that what you are going after, thinking it through, that it aligns with your value system, that it leaves you feeling good and better afterwards, not bad about yourself or shameful or beating yourself up. It's just like anything, and I use this metaphor a lot because there's that thing about eating. You know, when something is so delicious and you're lusting for more, you're full, but you're not stuffed. And there's that point that's just past full, that's okay, I'm full enough now. And then there's uncomfortable. There's that feeling of, oh my God, this is so bad. I have to go for a walk. I'm not eating anything for another day, which of course never happens because our digestion is moving so slowly because we've just packed ourselves to the gills. So you don't want to eat like that at Thanksgiving. Just a reminder that you can nibble all through Thanksgiving Day and not just lay belly up on the floor. So that you're not hurting yourself with your lust, that you're titrating it, that your desire is something that you own, it doesn't own you. So when you peel away the layers, there's a clash between our lustful choices and our values and our ideals, all of which are deeply internal to us. So we have to reconcile those differences in order to be sexually healthy adults. And there is no one right way. We are all so incredibly different. Like that person who wrote and said they don't really have much sexual desire. So what? There are many, many other things to desire in life, or that I should be having sex this way, or my friends aren't having sex that way. There's this constant comparison with our desires and our lives and our money and our sexuality that really keeps us all, I think, quite depressed. And in fact, there's some studies that have come out recently. I'm sure you've all heard also about how despondent teenagers and young people are because of social media, because there's this chronic FOMO that goes on that doesn't allow for us to live our own lives the way we want to live them in these beautiful, lustful ways. So, how do you allow lust for your life, your pleasure, without crossing a line? How do you know when you have crossed a line? Like, where's that tipping point before you feel so stuffed you feel sick? And what's your personal line? And can you hold on to that without collapsing on yourself in the face of pressure? Pressure would be if you're dating somebody and they want to be more sexual than you do and you're not ready for it, or you know that doing that is going to leave you feeling empty or wanting something, and that you want to slow things down. And it doesn't matter your gender. One of the myths about sex and sexuality is that, you know, men are always really ready, willing, and able to lunge at sex. And that's not true. I've met many, many men that are highly relational. They're not just into having sex to relieve tension, which is why most people have sex. They're interested in a more psychological experience with somebody, a more connecting, more erotic experience with someone. So remember that too much of a good thing is gluttonous and it makes us feel sick, that we all get to decide what the right amount is and what's right for us. And what you want today may not be what you want tomorrow. So don't put any um, expectations on yourself to perform a certain way. Just let yourself be and see what comes up. And I'll go back to my coffee example. If you get a hankering for something in the middle of the day today, a piece of pie, a cup of coffee, a piece of cake, just stop for a minute and ask yourself, what do I really want? And can I get what I want? Or am I going to settle for something that's kind of subpar and then I'm going to feel sick about it afterwards or wish I hadn't done it? Okay, someone says I'm married to a sex addict who had an extremely enmeshed relationship with his mother and father and was an angry alcoholic. How can he know what his true authentic sexuality looks like when he was raised in that environment? The things he says are what he wants and desires is not conducive to a healthy monogamous relationship. Lust has most definitely caused a lot of issues with us and played a part. Well, I would say that you're asking the wrong question because you're asking questions about what he can do. And I think the question for you is about what do you want and what are you going to do in this relationship? And you have to be disinterested in what he does or doesn't do. He's going to show up the way he shows up. And so all you can do is pay attention to his actions, not what he's saying. How hard is he actually working on these issues? And where does that leave you? And what do you want for your one beautiful lust filled life? And does it include all of these issues or is it something else? Um, can you please refer me to further resources about the lust circuit in the brain? Would love to know who or what bodies of work are mapping that out. Well, there's an extremely technical book called Affective Neuroscience by Jaak Panksepp. And then he wrote a book that was slightly more accessible called The Architecture of the Brain, that he wrote with an author named Bivens. And the architecture of the brain is part of the Norton series on interpersonal neurobiology. So you'll find all of that information there. Based on a neurobiological explanation, is there a reason some people may have heightened activation in the lust circuit? Is there a specific historical profile that can cause this? My guess is there is, but I don't know about any research on that. All mammals have these exact same circuits, every single mammal. And that was the really famous and intricate work of Jaak Panksepp, who's since passed away. He studied rats for all of his career. And he saw that, our brains, the architecture of our brains are almost identical. They don't have the neocortex. They don't have our capacity for thinking, obviously. But these circuits that run through them are identical to our brainstem circuits. And so, again, you can look at that literature and see, but, why would somebody have a more robust lust circuit or a more robust play circuit? I don't know that there would be that many differences. I think the differences come much later in the infant uh, primary caregiver dyadic experience when these circuits are being brought to fruition, and whether or not that mother is anxious, depressed, etc. I'm in a long distance relationship and we're at a point where things are not interesting. I'm not sure if the lust is gone. Well, it may very well be. And if things have gotten disinteresting, it's because there's a limitation to long distance relationships. You can't really touch that person with any regularity. You're not going out on a day to day, week to week basis where you're continuing to have novel experiences of the person over time. At some point, it just falls flat. So you may want to reconsider whether it's time for one person to move or time to move on. Can a sex addict experience both bad lust when acting out and healthy lust when with a spouse? I would say yes, that's likely true. Assuming that the lust you're having with your spouse is associative, that you're not dissociated, that you're not engaged in some kind of fantasy about somebody else when you're with them, that you're present with them. You mentioned anger many times. What is the connection between anger, fear, and lust? Well, there are three different circuits, actually, and they can get fused. So if you have a child who is being abused, let's say there's danger in the household, which is going to activate the fear circuit. There's also rage in the household, which is going to activate the anger circuit. And when we are scared, when we are in high sympathetic arousal, it is arousing to the autonomic nervous system. So there can be genital arousal in the face of danger. This is why when women are raped, they often orgasm because they're having arousal in the system. Their genitals are activated, their female is lubricating, and that is an evolutionary directive. So to keep her safe, actually, if she wasn't lubricating, and she would be a mess internally after that rape. So these circuits can get fused, having sex addicts seeking dangerous, shameful sex over time, that's the only kind of sex they like because it's the kind of sex, the kind of arousal they experienced in long-term chronic abuse in childhood. Can you recommend practices to embrace the positive lust of healthy sexuality while recovering from sexually compulsive behavior? Yes, I mean, that's a beautiful question. So I would say that lust can be in your outer circle or your top lines where you're practicing really paying attention to your body internally, checking in with your body and making contact with all of the pleasurable experiences you have day in and day out, as I was asking earlier. So, what are the pleasurable things that you feel every single day? And can you let yourself notice what you're feeling in your body so that when you're drinking a nice cup of tea, you're actually drinking it. You feel the sensation in your mouth, you feel it going down your throat, you taste the tea or the sweetness of it, you feel the warmth. That is a mindfulness practice. That is a practice of pleasure, if you will. All right, so we're going to have to wrap this out, but I'd like you to think about taking an inventory of lust in your life. What specific images or event provoke your lust or your pleasure? And write down the feelings that happen in your body and being when you think about these pleasurable um, things in your life. And then trace back to the earliest times that you felt these feelings. What other feelings can you remember at that time? And how was your lust or your pleasure resolved? And recall one past situation that stirred lust. Imagine a way for that situation to be fully resolved, but that doesn't result in sex or romance. And then ask yourself, what drives my lust? My lust for life, my lust for pleasure. And don't just reduce it to genital stimulation. All right. So thank you all for your participation today. This was a very lusty conversation. You can see all the different areas that we covered and talked about, that this is not a simple topic, but a complex one, and one that I would really invite you all to challenge yourselves with, teasing out what is healthy lust, what is toxic lust. So for now, thank you again. I'm Alex Katehakis. This is Center for Healthy Sex Mirror of Intimacy webinar. Today's November 8th, and I hope you all have a beautiful November and a happy Thanksgiving. And I look forward to seeing you in December.